Hello, welcome to my channel and welcome to this tutorial on how to paint some tiny mushrooms. I say the word tutorial quite loosely because this is going to be more of a guide and a paint along. I'm going to share with you how I painted these. I'll be using water mixable oils, but regular oils would obviously work for this too. And I'm going to be painting onto oil painting paper, which is specifically for oil painting. It's not just regular paper, but again, you can use whatever surface material you normally use for your oil painting. Please excuse the state of my palette. I thought I would share the colours with you, but this is after the painting's been done, so it's not really Instagram worthy. Now, you don't need to use all of these because this is a little bit excessive. I had these laid out for a painting that I did previously, and I didn't want to waste the paint. We have got titanium white, phthalo blue, cerulean blue, phthalo green, sap green, lemon yellow, Naples yellow, yellow ochre, raw sienna, raw umber, burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, and ivory black. I also use Gamblin solvent-free gel as my medium. This is definitely excessive. You can do it with less paints than this. I would say you could do this with just a blue. It doesn't need to be phthalo. A blue like this, a red, a green, yellow ochre I think would be a good yellow to use, and then titanium white, and maybe just like an earth tone, a raw umber. So you could definitely do this with a reduced palette. You don't need all of these, but that is what I've got. I will discuss my colour mixes as we go, so hopefully we'll be able to work through this together regardless of the colours you're starting with. And with all that being said, let's get into it. I just drew around the base of my cup to get this outline of a circle, and we're just going to start with a really simple sketch. These are the mushrooms that inspired the painting, so we're changing the background slightly, but this is our starting point. So we'll keep the sketch very simple, very quick, and then start painting. I like to paint in 2 layers, but my way of painting isn't the only way of painting. This is just how I like to do it. We're going to do a very quick layer to begin with, where we'll just put the initial block in of colour very thinly, and then I'll do another detailed layer over the top of that. So we can be pretty flexible when it comes to this background, because the idea is we just want a nice dark colour that these white mushrooms can stand out nicely against. So I'm using phthalo blue as the main colour, but I'm adding in a little bit of green and red just to tone the blue down a little bit. I can add in a bit of ivory black or raw umber, again just to grey it down so it's not quite so luminous, and then a touch of titanium white just to brighten it ever so slightly. But you could simplify that. You could just have blue and black together, blue and raw umber together. Anything to create a nice dark shade for the mushrooms to stand out against should be fine. And I'm keeping this layer super thin. I'm spreading the paint out. I'm not putting thick sections of paint on there because I want to be able to paint over this with thicker paint later a little bit more easily. So I'm trying to keep this as thin as possible. And then we can take that exact same colour and just add it in the foreground for the areas where we want a little bit of shadow. I'm going to add a little bit more brown to this mixture, so either raw umber or burnt sienna or whatever earth tone you have, and then a touch more white as well to brighten it ever so slightly, and that's going to create a little bit more variation in this foreground. These are some of the colours that I ended up using in the foreground, if that gives you a better idea of what's going on rather than me just explaining it, but lots of earthy tones, blues and browns and greys. Because this is the first layer and we're going to paint over all of this, it doesn't necessarily matter if these colours aren't exactly right. We're going to go over this again, so don't worry if you can't colour match precisely, and also a bit of variation is great. I did film more of my colour mixing process for the second layer, so if you want to see more precise colours then you can do there, because I realise this is a little bit vague, but because this is the first layer I think we can get away with that. We are getting slightly lighter every time we add a bit more paint. So now I am adding a slightly more orangey brown. I've added a bit more red and some yellow ochre into that brown mixture, just brightening it up a little bit. And then we can increase the yellow ochre, add a little bit more white. If you have Naples yellow, I know not everybody has that, but Naples yellow is a really good one to use for brightening up these earth tones. So I'm using that here, and we're just kind of dotting the paint around, making a few shapes, not being too specific with it, just have some fun with it and see what kind of patterns you can make in the foreground. Again, I'm trying to keep this paint very, very thin, and I'm not talking about adding specific paint thinners, I'm just talking about physically adding a very thin layer onto the paper so it's really smooth, very blended. I'm not wanting to add those thick, chunky impasto marks because that's going to be really difficult to paint over the top of with a second layer. All I really want to do here is cover the white of the paper, and that is it. And like I mentioned at the start, everyone paints slightly differently. This is something that works for me, but maybe not everybody would like to paint this way. But I enjoy having everything mapped out, and then it's much easier for me to add the detail over the top later. Once we've got the foreground in, we can start working on the little mossy section on the top of that. And to begin with, I'm going to take that dark background colour and I'm just going to dot it in that white background area that we've still got left, so we can have some of that darker background shining through. And then when we put the green over the top, it's going to look more layered. And with the green, we're going to do similar to how we did the foreground. We're going to start with the darkest green first and then add some lighter marks over the top of that. I am using phthalo green and sap green together. I'm also adding a little bit of red into my green just so it's not quite so bright and cartoon-like. I am keeping it pretty dark to begin with, and then we will add some Naples yellow to brighten it up, or you could add titanium white if you don't have Naples yellow. If you've got another yellow, if your green is looking a little bit washed out, you can add a bit of yellow in there or a bit of blue, just until you get the shade that you like. But play around with that and change the colors until you've got something that you're happy with. So for these mushrooms, I don't just want to paint them titanium white, we want to have a little bit of variation in there. So you want to create a very light grey for the stem and then a slightly lighter version for the cap. To do that, you could just use ivory black and white if you wanted to keep it super simple, although I think greys look nicer when they have other colours mixed in there. I think for this I used a bit of phthalo blue and a little bit of raw umber and then added in my white and then just added a little bit more white for the caps of the mushrooms. One thing that I like to do is I like to use the colours that are already on my palette and then just adjust them slightly for a new section of the painting. That way the painting is pretty tied together because all of the colours relate to each other, but it does mean that making a tutorial is sometimes not the most straightforward thing because you've got to remember all the colours that you put in there to make that mixture in the first place. But I still think it's a good idea. It saves some time because you don't have to make a mixture from scratch, and it means all of your painting kind of looks like it fits together. I don't really know how to explain that very well, but to me it makes sense. So if you have some leftover mixture on your palette from another section of the painting, sometimes it's easier to try and adjust that than it is to try and make a new color from scratch. One thing I'm doing here is I'm dragging out the bottom edge of the cap into the background a little bit. So we're bringing a tiny bit of that background colour into the bottom edge of the mushroom. So we're going to have a slightly blurred effect to the edge. And then when we add our lighter colours in the next layer, that's going to look pretty cool underneath, like the mushroom's almost glowing. So I thought that would be a useful thing to point out. I ended up brightening up some of the green mossy areas a little bit here because I felt like they were looking a little bit too dark. It's not completely necessary because we are going to go over this again, but obviously I felt like I needed to do this at the time, so that is what's going on here. So this next step is completely optional, but what I did was I took a blending brush and I blended all of that initial painting. I didn't go in too hard here because I didn't want to ruin all of the work that we just put in, but I wanted to blend the edges nicely, and really it's just to ensure that that first layer is really nice and flat and that all of the white of the paper underneath is completely covered. Again, I just want to reiterate that this is completely optional because it's really easy to go over the top with blending, and I don't want any of you to ruin your paintings at this stage. So now we're on to the second layer of oil paint, and this time I'm going to share with you some of these mixes on this very untidy palette. So I'm going to go over the background again first, and we're taking some ivory black, phthalo blue, a little bit of alizarin crimson, a little bit of phthalo green and just mixing that together. And you can add a bit of white if that's a little bit too dark, or just use it exactly as it is. And I'm just going to put this over the top of the background. Now, you might not need to do this stage. If you're happy with how your background looks, then that's absolutely fine. I'm going to go over the top of it again just to darken it up a little bit, and also to tidy up around the edges. I'm going to bring this right up to the edge of the mushrooms so that there's no big gaps in there, and that way the painting should come together nicely. With this layer, I'm making the paint slightly thicker. I'm using more paint in these mixtures so that it sits on top of that first layer nicely. And you'll see we're just kind of repeating the process of what we did the first time around, although I'm being a bit more precise now and slightly more detailed. The next mix is a slightly lighter shadow colour, so I'm starting again with ivory black, and I'm adding in some phthalo blue and then some titanium white just to brighten that up a little bit. If the blue is looking a little bit too luminous, then I tone that down with a brown, and raw umber is my favourite at the moment. For me, a lot of colour mixing is trial and error, and that can be difficult at the beginning, but the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. I think you kind of get to a place where you just know the sort of colour you need to add to get to where you want to go. So here I'm adding a bit more titanium white into the mixture just to brighten things up a little bit, and then I'll use that as a base and alter it as I need to for the rest of the painting. The brush marks that we put down now will be visible at the end of the painting, so I'm trying to be a bit more mindful about how I do this from this point in. I'm not blending everything, I'm putting the marks down and leaving them as much as I can, and I'm paying a bit more attention to my reference photos to try and create the same shapes or similar shapes to what I can see there. If you overdo the lighter areas, you can always go back in with a darker colour for the shadow, although I try not to do this too many times because it's a small painting and it will quickly get overworked very easily. I like to add a little bit of variation in the foreground. We've used a lot of blues and greys so far, so now I'm moving on to a slightly more brown mixture. Raw umber is the base, and I'm using some titanium white and a little bit of alizarin crimson in there, but you could add your own colours into that to try and get something similar. And it's really just a contrast against the shadows that we've got already. I'm not going to use that excessively. I'm just going to dot it here and there, and then we can move on to a lighter mixture of paint. I'm using yellow ochre and raw umber as a base here, but I'm kind of building on top of the colour that we already had on the palette. I guess this is where the tutorial slightly falls apart a bit because I didn't film that initial section, but there's probably a little bit of red in there too. It's kind of like a orangey earthy tone. See there, I put some cadmium red in there as well, and a little bit of Naples yellow, but it's just a trial and error until you get something similar to this, and then we can start adding in some highlight sections into the foreground. Another thing that I think can be quite useful to do, which pretty much follows on from what I was saying before, I think, is to have a base color like this, and then every now and then just add a tiny amount of another color in there. Like you could add a bit more cadmium red or a little bit of blue in some instances. You could brighten it up in some sections. I'm only talking about like teeny tiny minor adjustments, nothing really drastic, but it just creates a tiny bit of variation, and I think that helps the painting look a little bit more realistic than just having one solid block of colour. The base tones are getting progressively lighter as we go along, and I'm using Naples yellow to brighten things up a bit, but you could use titanium white if you prefer, or if you don't have Naples yellow. If things get a little bit too washed out by adding white, then you can always add in extra colours just to bring that pigment back. When you're happy with the foreground, we can move on to the moss, and we're going to start by adding a dark layer of green to begin with and just dot that into the background. That was primarily sap green with a little bit of red, a bit of phthalo green in there as well, but it was very dark. What you're seeing now is me mixing a slightly lighter mixture just to put over the top of that initial one. So I'm just adjusting the darker green that I already used by adding some titanium white, more phthalo green, and then I'm just going to use a small brush just to dot that on the top. Now I'm getting a bit more precise. I'm taking more care with how I dot the paint on so that it looks a little bit more like leaves, and I'm extending that into the background. I'm going to make the mixture a little bit lighter by adding Naples yellow, but you could use a lemon yellow or titanium white, and we're just trying to make it look a bit more like moss. Next up, it's time to paint the mushrooms, and we're going to start out with a grey colour. This is probably a bit of phthalo blue and raw umber to begin with, and then a lot of white to brighten things up, but you could add some black in there or another type of brown. I'm also adding in some red, so we've got a slightly more reddy pink tone to this stalk, and we're just going to add that and see how it goes. I'm using a pretty small brush to do this. I wanted this mixture to be fairly dark in comparison to the cap of the mushroom. It's light in comparison to everything else, but we want to leave ourselves somewhere to go with the highlights for the top of the mushrooms. Precision is key here, so I'm taking this very steady, but if I do happen to make the stalks a little bit too big, I can always take that background colour and then narrow them down a little bit. To begin with, it's easier just to add the stalks in all the same colour, but then we can add some variation afterwards if you like. I'm going to take some cadmium red and yellow ochre and put it into that mixture that we had for the stalks, and I'm just going to use this tiny brush to add it in a couple of places here and there. You can change the colour of the mixture whichever way you like and just add a bit of variation into these stalks. I think that helps to make them look a little bit more interesting and realistic. I actually think painting the caps was probably the most straightforward part of this painting. I started out by using the stem colour just to add in the shadowy sections of the caps of the mushrooms, and then to make that lighter I added some titanium white and some Naples yellow, but you could use a different yellow, and I pretty much put that everywhere apart from in the shadowy sections, as you can see here. I took a really tiny brush and I dragged some of the background colour up into the caps of the mushrooms. Now it's important to wipe your brush when you do this so you don't spread too much paint around, and that just helped to create a little bit more detail around the edges of these mushrooms. I don't know if you can tell here, but I also didn't drag that brighter yellow colour all the way to the edges, so we're going to have a slightly darker skirt around the bottom of the mushrooms. And one of the final stages is to add the highlights, so I'm taking titanium white and a little bit of blue-grey colour to contrast with the yellow, and I'm just adding in some highlights onto these mushrooms. There we have it, one tiny mushroom painting. Thank you so much for watching along with this, and if you've given it a go, that's great. Please let me know how you get on in the comments. Once again, thanks for sticking around, and I will see you next time.